All right, so this is my video talking about my experience reading and studying Albert Camus' famous L'Étranger, which is his first novel, I believe, and it's also one of his most widely acclaimed. It's considered one of the best novels, not only in French literature, but just world literature in general. So I'm going to go through the process of talking about what I thought about the book, what I thought about the process of learning about it, and whether I think you yourself should read it if you're a student of French. So let's get into it. So first of all, what is this story actually about? What is L'Étranger? What is it about? So it's about, to give a very brief summary, it's kind of hard to summarize it, but it's about a young man named Meursault who learns at the beginning of the novel that his mother is dead. There's the famous line, Aujourd'hui, maman est morte. Uh, and and yeah, so it's just a very blunt way of talking about his mother. And so there's this long, actually probably the hardest part of the book is the opening where he goes to the wake and he goes and walks to bury the body and all the people that visit. So that's probably the hardest part of the book, actually, all the descriptive language that he uses. But after the burial, he goes back to his day-to-day life. It takes place in Algeria, uh, which was a French colony at the time. And then also he becomes friends with this person named Raymond, who is not a very nice guy. He's kind of a terrible person. And all I can say is that he ultimately sort of indirectly leads the main character onto a destructive path, among other factors. I'm not going to say much more than that, just because even though it's not really a plot-heavy book, I don't want to spoil anything for anyone, but that's in the gist what this is about. Okay, so that's the setup. Those are the characters. Uh, and that's pretty much it. So, first of all, why did I decide to study l'étranger? What was the reason? So, there's a couple of reasons. One is that it is actually considered one of the best novels of all time. And Albert Camus, he won a Nobel Prize. Albert Camus, I'll pronounce it correctly. He didn't. He won a Nobel Prize for his body of work, and the one of the big reasons is l'étranger. So that was one thing, and I'm predominantly focused on studying French literature as part of my French studies. That's my main focus above even talking to people or movies or TV. Another reason is that it's highly recommended as one of the very first novels that people who are learning French should read. It's actually kind of a cliche. People always suggest Le Petit Prince and also L'Étranger as quote unquote easy novels to read as a beginner, or sometimes they'll say for intermediates. It's the advice is a little for both. Okay, so that's why I did it. Also, that it's kind of short, so it felt like a manageable. It's only about 100 pages in normal size. My copy of L'Étranger, it's actually 200, but the pages are quite short and small. So it's about a 100-page book, basically. So nice and short, so it's manageable to study in a reasonable amount of time. Okay. So why do people in general recommend L'Étranger as a novel for either beginners or intermediates? So this is what I think people typically say. So first of all, it uses simple language. It doesn't use a tense called the passé simple, which is a past tense used pretty much only these days in novels. And even in novels, it's becoming less and less predominant. And because it's very intimidating for beginners or intermediates to see le passé simple because they've studied all these tenses and they're like, oh, another tense that it looks totally different that I have to memorize, and it makes them angry, I think. And so it doesn't use the passé simple, it uses passé composé and la parfait and stuff like that. So it's like, oh, great, it's simple language, awesome. And another reason, kind of like I mentioned, is that it's quite short, only 100 pages. And that, again, lastly, it's easy to read for beginner slash intermediate students of French. That is generally what people say. And I will go into later in this presentation what are my thoughts on that. So first of all, though, let's talk about how did I feel about the novel? Did I enjoy it? So I will say, yes, I loved it. I think it was an amazing novel. But I will say that when I got to the end, the novel really left me really cold, a bit angry, a bit sad, bit of ennui. Ennui, is that an expression, I guess? Very confused and just very conflicted about the main character and everything he does through the course of the novel. It makes you feel really ugly, honestly, about the character and about the world. So it's not a very uplifting book, absolutely not. It's quite dark, it's a very dark book, honestly, and a very angry book. But still, I thought it was amazing. Main reason, it has extremely beautiful imagery. That's part of the reasons it's actually kind of difficult to read sometimes, because there's lots of extremely specific descriptions of light and about the heat and observations about the people in his town that he's not really a part of in a way. And that stuff is amazing. The world building is amazing, actually. But what I mean by that is it feels like a real place. It really feels like real people. It really feels like a real location, it feels like it really happened. Okay. And finally, it's a very interesting philosophical and emotional novel. Even though they don't really talk about philosophy that much in the novel, I think it really I think the novel really makes you think about our role in society, social conventions, and whether that should influence how we treat people. And it's also an extremely emotional novel. Even though the main character is not a very emotional person, you can kind of see glimmers of his emotion sort of slipping out once in a while, which is very cool. And it makes me feel very emotional. Like there's parts that are exciting, there's parts that are like shocking, there's parts that are extremely sad, some are kind of funny. It's a very emotional. I might be overselling it. You may read it and be like, this was not that exciting. This is not that sad. So it depends, I guess, on your how you read literature and how much you like literature. But I thought it was an extremely emotional novel with lots of ups and downs. Okay. So first of all, though, how did I actually study the novel? So what I didn't do is just sort of read through it and look up words as I go. That's not how I did it. So what I did is basically what I did with Le Petit Prince when I studied that, which was the novel I studied before L'Étranger, because it's the cliche novel to read. So basically what I did is for every sentence, so I'd read a sentence, the first sentence, and decide, are there any words in here I don't know? If there are, I would make two flashcards using Anki for that word and then do that for each word in the sentence that I didn't know. And then I'd move to the second sentence. Are there any words here that I don't know? If there aren't any words I don't know, move on to the third one, and then fourth one. And every time a new word shows up that I don't understand or don't know, I would make two flashcards. And I'll talk about how many flashcards I made. Now, this is not the only way you should be reading novels, in my opinion. You should really be doing a lot of extensive reading where you read things that are enjoyable but not crazy, crazy hard. And you look up words as you go once in a while and just sort of try and make inferences as best you can. That's a really good thing to do as much as you can, but this is not the way I approached it. I really wanted to study the novel, try and understand it as close as I possibly could. And and yeah, so one thing I didn't do though is I didn't make flashcards just because it wasn't in my Anki deck. I would only do it if I didn't understand the word. So if it's a conjugation that I may not have technically seen yet, but it was a simple conjugation that I immediately understood 100%. I would make a flashcard for that. And if it was like a cognate that I understand immediately, like if it coincided with an English word exactly, as far as I could tell from the context, I didn't make a flashcard for that either, unless I really wanted to, unless I liked the word and wanted to make sure I remembered it. And sometimes I did actually skip words that I didn't actually even understand what they meant in English. Like I would look at the French definition, didn't really understand it. Look at the English translation, didn't really understand it. Try to look at the English definition, didn't really understand it. So those words I just left as well, because there's no point in memorizing something that you just don't even have a clue what it means. There wasn't that many words like that, but I did skip a few in that way. There was also some extremely specific funeral attire that they talked about, or clothing, that some of it I skipped, uh, and some trees, for example, and like things like that. That I mean, it might be nice to know, but I skipped those as well. But I would say I learned almost every word in the book that I didn't know, almost every word. Okay. So after this process, oh, by the way, if you want to know more about this process of studying a novel the way I do it, I'll leave a link in the description about how I went through Le Petit Prince, and I use basically the exact same method. And it's a good method, I think, for learning vocabulary. It's just quite slow, but if you're interested in checking that out for some more detail, I'm just kind of glossing over it right now. But if you want a lot more extreme detail about how to study a novel in French, the way I do it at least, you can check out the link in the description. Anyways, so now the question is this actually an easy novel? Because that's what people say. People say that it's the first novel you should read because it's a really easy novel, but it's also good. So this is actually a pretty hard question because it really depends on what your level is. Because if you're a fluent native French speaker, yes, it will be very easy. But the question is it easy for a beginner or an intermediate. And the problem also is that people define those terms very differently. So I would say a beginner is someone who knows less than 2 to 3,000 words. If you're below 2,000 words, you are definitely a beginner. If you know 3,000 words, are you intermediate in French? And if you're a native English speaker, yeah, probably, I guess I would say. If you know about 3,000 words, you're an intermediate speaker. So, which means that if you know 3,000 words, would you find l'étranger easy? No, not absolutely not. For one, I would say it's actually significantly more difficult than Le Petit Prince for a few reasons. Um, the main reason, I guess I'll get to that in a second, but one thing is that people always say that, like I said before, people say that L'étranger doesn't have passé simple, so therefore it's much easier than other novels. But the fact that it doesn't have le passé simple, it doesn't make any difference in terms of its difficulty because honestly, le passé simple is not hard to understand at all. It's just a little, it looks a little different. And other than a few irregular verbs, it's not hard whatsoever. You just have to sort of get used to it, maybe memorize some of the more irregular forms of it, but it doesn't make a novel harder. Honestly, it really doesn't. Maybe I just take for granted some knowledge of Le Passé Simple because I work through Le Petit Prince, but I'm telling you, it doesn't make L'Étranger any easier whatsoever. So one thing I will say, so why is it so hard? So I'm saying right now, for an intermediate person who knows less than 5,000 words, it's a hard book. And the main reason is because some of the descriptions and thoughts that the main character engages in, they're really difficult to understand and parse. So you can understand, there were several sentences where I could understand every single word in the sentence. I would memorize what they mean, the definition, what conjugation it is, whatever. But then I would still read the sentence and just have no idea what it's saying. Not just because the grammar was too difficult. Occasionally, the grammar syntax I just couldn't wrap my brain around. But also just he would talk about things in very figurative ways. I think they were figurative ways because it's hard for me to tell if this is just a way French people talk about things or is this like a figurative device he's using unusual words to describe things that he observes or he feels. So, for example, like I can't give a good example right now, but there was plenty of sentences where I had to really like stretch my brain to really understand what he was even talking about. And there was plenty of sentences. There's a few sentences I just honestly don't understand. I do not understand what Camus meant by the sentence, even though I know all the words that they mean. As far as I can tell, I can understand every tense that's there, but all put together, I just don't understand it. And that does not sound. And I know about, I would describe myself as probably an intermediate, lower intermediate learner. I know after I probably had about 3,000 words. I knew about 3,000 words when I started this book, and so I would say about lower intermediate, and yeah, it just was, there were some sentences I just could not understand. So what does that mean? That mean so maybe I'm just a beginner. Maybe most people's definition of intermediate is someone who knows 5 or 6,000 words. In that case, yeah, maybe l'étranger would be not so challenging. But I don't know if people consider 5 or 6,000 word vocabulary a lower intermediate or intermediate level. I mean, yeah, I guess it is in the grand scheme of things intermediate, but I don't know. Maybe I think people need to be clear about how difficult this novel is because I think it is quite difficult. Now, again, there are some definitely very simple, easy passages. Absolutely. The parts where he's just talking about things very matter of factly. And yeah, those parts of the novel are easy, but see, people seem to forget that so much of the novel is him just describing the sun or like the feeling of the sand or the waves in very detailed and poetic ways. And they're very challenging to parse. They just really are. And I don't, sometimes I just feel like people have not read this book and realize how difficult some passages are. Again, maybe I just underestimate my level. Maybe I'm like basically a beginner and I don't understand anything in French. Maybe that's what it is. But um, I think it's very much quite a challenge. And finally, it is very much literature. Like it's not just like a fun story. It's not Harry Potter. It's maybe controversial, but when I say literature, I mean like a novel that's meant to be artistic, not really meant to be a fun, exciting plot, but trying to be, I guess, contemplative and descriptive and symbolic and uh, artistic for a better word. I guess I'm not explaining myself too well, but it's very much that. It's not fun for a beginner unless you really like literature. I really like literature in English, and that's why I want to read French. but it is very much literature. And I think most people don't like literature, and that's totally fine. I'll get to that in a second. But uh, and the fact that it's literature instead of just a fun story like Jules Verne or something, that makes it also quite challenging. So here's a couple examples of some pretty tough that I understand now that I know these words and I've seen them dozens and dozens of times. But here's a few examples. I'll do my best to pronounce them properly. Aujourd'hui, le soleil débordant qui faisait tressaillir le paysage le rendait inhumain et déprimant. And then the second one says, Sur le sable, la mer haletait de toute la respiration rapide et étouffée de ses petites vagues. So if you think those are easy, you probably will find this novel easy. I probably had to look up almost all the words in these sentences other than le and qui and stuff. For the first one, for example, I had to learn débordant, tressaillir. I think I knew paysage as well. Rondé, inhumain, déprimant. I had to learn all these. The other one, alte, I didn't know. And then étouffé. And I knew the other words, but it was I found it a tough sentence to parse and to really understand what did he actually mean by this sentence. And I think I understand it now, but like I said, this would be a good litmus test. If you think these two sentences pretty easy to understand, no problems, you will find this novel pretty easy. Just because you find these hard doesn't mean you can't read it, because they're hard for me, and now I understand them, but this is just what you're getting into with a big part of the book. And I thought it was quite challenging to parse these type of sentences, and they're throughout the whole book. So they're beautiful, but difficult in my opinion. Okay, so why do people recommend L'Étranger to beginners if it actually is really challenging and difficult? I honestly have no idea. Sometimes I wonder if it's just advice that people have spread to other people and they just repeat it over and over again without really thinking critically about it. Um, because again, it depends how you talk about it. Like when you say beginner, what are we actually saying? Do we mean a beginner is still someone who only knows 5,000 words? 5,000 words is quite a lot. Some people say that's roughly B2 level. That's not beginner. That's upper intermediate on the cusp of becoming advanced because I guess, I don't know. It's hard to say, but like, I don't think most beginners or intermediates know 5,000 words, the vast majority. Um, and especially if they haven't read a novel yet. Like if this is one of their first novels, I guarantee you they haven't learned 5,000 words. Or maybe they have, I don't know. I don't know anything about what people study, but it seems weird. Where would they get for these 5,000 words? I guess they would read newspaper articles and get them from there, or lists, I guess. I don't know. But anyways, I think you're gonna have you're gonna struggle through this book if you know less than 4 to 5,000 words, because I knew about 3,000 words and I struggled. And like I said, typical beginners will have less than 2,000 words. If this is like the first novel after Duolingo, for example, you're going to have a tough time. It's going to be really difficult. That doesn't mean you shouldn't read it, but you're going to have a tough time. And another thing, I'm slightly sarcastic here when I say long, boring descriptions because I don't think they're boring. I think they're quite beautiful and interesting to contemplate. But like the long, boring descriptions and observations made by the narrator, they're pretty challenging, like I've said. And I think a lot of people would find that quite boring, like not very interesting, what this guy thinks about the sun or how that makes him feel, or him like feeling alienated by everyone in the town and just looking out his window and noticing the people walk by. I think most people would find that really boring. And I think it's really interesting. I thought it was really cool. But those observations and those feelings and like the way that he thinks about society and the world, that's pretty much the reason you read the novel. And if you don't think that's interesting, you shouldn't read this novel because it's just not for you. And that's okay. You don't have to read this book, but you just have to know what you're getting into. And then finally, I don't think this is a kind of book where you get much out of just understanding the gist of it. I don't think it would be very rewarding because, again, the whole point is all these little descriptions of the countryside and the way the sun made him feel and how he thought about, being on the beach and other situations in the novel. And all that stuff, in my opinion, it's very important and he uses his words pretty precisely. I'm not good enough at French to really understand the full nuance of all the connotations of the word choice and stuff, but I feel like if I just looked up words as I went to try to get a general understanding of this novel, I don't think that would be very rewarding, way less rewarding. I would get almost nothing out of it, in my opinion. I would feel like it's kind of a boring book. But really digging into it, you get much more. So it's not a very good book for just working on the gist. And you really have to understand it, I think, to a higher level, in my opinion. Not that I have 100% understanding of it because I'm you have to be an extremely high level in a language to really understand the very specific nuance of certain word choices and stuff. But this is not the book for just skimming through it, in my opinion. So now, now that I've like kind of talked stuff about people who recommend L'Étranger as a beginner novel, what novels should actually be recommended to beginners? So in my opinion, they should have interesting characters, they should have a fun, interesting plot, they should have relatively simple grammar, straightforward grammar at the very least, and a relatively accessible vocabulary. Now, this one, the last one's tricky because novels just inherently have lots and lots of vocabulary, and you can't get around that. Um, but it shouldn't be super obscure either. And in my opinion, L'étranger basically fails at all these. Doesn't really have accessible vocabulary. It's pretty tough. Grammar, maybe not terribly complicated, but some of these sentence constructions I found quite challenging to parse. The plot is it's not really interesting. It's artistic. It's interesting in that sense, but it's not a fun ride like Star Wars or something. The characters are interesting, but not in a way that again most people probably would enjoy. Uh, so this is why I don't think it's very good for beginners at all. Okay, so what should beginners actually read, in my opinion? Because I've been a beginner, you may consider myself still a beginner. I don't know, but here's four choices that I think are pretty solid. Now, Arribateur à l'école des sorciers is a great option, and it's kind of a cliche, but it's a good for a few reasons. That even though there's a lot of vocab that you probably won't know, and there is passé simple, of course, the fact that you know the story makes such a big difference, and you're not going to understand a lot at the beginning. But if you keep on reading, look up words occasionally, keep on reading, something will happen about halfway through the novel, and you'll actually slowly start to actually understand what they're talking about. So, Arrivateur, that's a really good option. Another one, Le bizarre incident du chien pendant la nuit. I've never said that out loud before, but hopefully that was correct pronunciation. This one's a good one as well, just because I know it's a translation, just like the first one, but it's relatively simple vocabulary because it's from the perspective of a person with autism, and also the grammar is relatively simple as well. So it's straight to the point, not terribly hard, but it's also a really good book as well. So that's a really good option. Another one, if you want to read real French written by a real French person, even 19th century French, Guy de Maupassant is also a really good option. His short stories are actually really accessible. Like they're not going to be like super easy, but way easier than anything else written in the 19th century, in my opinion. His short stories. I know they're not novels, but they're pretty fun. They're weird stories. I think you'll like them. And then also Le Petit Nicolas is also a great option. They're short stories as well, but again, the vocabulary is pretty manageable. Notice this is not Le Petit Prince, which is actually quite challenging for a beginner, but Le Petit Nicolas will be a fun challenge, and I recommend it. Okay. Okay, so let's talk some boring statistics about me studying L'Étranger. So I read and made flashcards for 87 days. It took me almost 3 months to read this 100-page book, but I learned a lot from it. I made 2,610 flashcards, 30 cards a day. That's like roughly 15 words per day. Uh, in that process, I learned approximately 1,100 to 1,200 words, which, cool. And it took me about an hour a day to study these flashcards. Um, and Now some of these cards that I was studying were made before I actually started the novel, but that's that's pretty much what I did, along with other activities. Okay, so long story short, should you read L'Étranger? That's kind of like the point of this video, right? I don't think you should read it because it's easy, because I think you're going to be in a rude awakening. It really is not that easy. Again, I worry that people will read it and be like, this easy book is just really boring. Well, it's not really that easy. It's very descriptive. I think you should read it if you really want to explore and understand a great work of literature, a great work of French literature, and because it is really a great book. It's just, it's not, you shouldn't read it just because it's easy or because people recommend it. You should look into the book, research a little bit about Camus, about his style of writing and stuff, maybe, and um, maybe even read the first chapter or something and try and work your way through it. But there's no reason you should read it. Don't read it because it's easy. Read it because you really want to explore it as a work of literature. And again, it's okay to not like literature. I say that as like artistic novels. It's a novel where not much happens. It's focused on just these absurd and immoral observations and thoughts of the main character. That's not really that interesting for most people. Again, unless you're really interested in literature, like I am. And if you are interested in that kind of stuff, like if you like reading it in English, for example, then do it. But if you're not really into that kind of stuff, artistic novels, there's lots of books in the world to read. Like, you don't have to read this book just because people say you should. Okay? So read it if you want to, but just be aware it's not going to be as easy as you think, and it's probably not going to be that interesting unless you like literature. If you like literature, it's an amazing novel to study. So, anyways, I'll finish this video and leave you with my favorite quote probably from the whole novel. I won't say when it takes place in the novel, but hopefully you get something out of it. Pour la première fois depuis bien des années, j'ai eu une envie stupide de pleurer parce que j'ai senti combien j'étais détesté par tous ces gens-là. I think this is a brilliant passage because I love how he talks about, so basically he's talking about for the first time in many years, he had the stupid feeling or stupid desire to cry because he felt how much people hated him there. And it's like such a lovely mixture of like anger and like he's letting his emotions sort of slip out, and then he's just like mad at the world. And I think it's an amazing passage. There's lots of great uh, quotes from this book, but anyways, I'll leave you with that. If you have any questions about the novel or if you're interested in reading it, let me know. And like I said, if you have any questions, make a comment. Anyways, have a good evening and bye.